Vasha Gandikota, co-general coordinator of Progressive International, that connects and supports and mobilizes activists all over the world. She's also responsible for the blueprint, so let's call it the think tank within Progressive International that designs policies to transform the institutions that impact our lives and our communities and our planet. Vasha summarized very briefly what we all represent, I think, when she was at the last Make Amazon Pay Day. And she said, Amazon is everywhere, but so are we. Vasha is everywhere, and she's here with us right now. Vasha Gandikota.
Am I audible to everyone in the room? Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jonas. I feel like I should start with an apology for false advertising. For any of you that's here expecting a horticulture class on how to grow an avocado, this is not that. I was hoping to start today's speech in a greenhouse in the Netherlands, but actually I think I'm going to start somewhere else, in Senegal, where I was a few months ago, on a specific island called Gori Island, which is off the coast of Senegal, across from Dakar, which some of you in this room might recognize as the central location from which nearly 4 decades of the transatlantic slave trade happened. And there's a particular monument there which is called the Gate or the Door of No Return, from which slaves from across the region, black people from Africa, were sent onto ships to never see any of their homelands again. But there was somebody else who was there before me, about 2 decades before me, which is then President of the United States, George Bush, who chooses that particular location to make a very important speech. He goes there to declare that America, the United States, had entered a new era in 2003. He says we're mindful of our past sins and now dedicated to the advance of human history. With apologies for bringing in unholy George Bush so early into my remarks, there is something to the kind of underlying sentiment there to that remark, right? Which is to draw a line in the sand, to say there was a break. There was colonialism, the outright horrors of eras past, and now we're in a new era. Perhaps we have imperialism, perhaps we have neocolonialism, but surely it's a bit more benign than the horrific stories of colonialism that we hear elsewhere. And you see this has a lot of purchase and a lot of vogue in now in climate discourse too, because truly if you were in some of these progressive rooms in North America, in Europe, you could believe that we were talking about reparations for climate, reparations for slavery, reparations for colonialism, that really we're entering a new era. And I think that's bullshit. And that's one propaganda that I truly, truly believe we have to take on before we can start talking about how to propagate life. And why do I think it's bullshit, right? Look at the world. I want to give you 3 stories today, from Honduras in the Caribbean to Zimbabwe in Africa, and come back perhaps to here, the Netherlands, and the International Court of Justice in The Hague next door. So what happens if you go to Honduras? If you go to Honduras today and you show up in Tegucigalpa, it's the capital city, you will see a government and a country that being held by its neck with a noose, which is in the hands of Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, who's made a fair few number of appearances in this congregation, from a crypto billionaire company in California. Why is that happening? How is it that a United States company is holding an entire country at the risk of bankruptcy? It's because Peter Thiel, with his vision, along with his merry band of friends, of course, from California, with the vision of building a free-floating micronation, had chosen one particular beautiful island called the island of Roatan in Honduras to build a libertarian paradise. Free-floating in every sense of the word, right? Free from regulations of the government and free from the reach of its own citizens. So what do you see when you go there? They used a government that was put in place after the US military coup ousted a left president, the President Zelaya, from his power, put in a new government, instituted unconstitutionally a law, a special economic zones law, that gave away the entire rights of a whole island to a private corporation in the United States to then essentially build a billionaire's playground. So if any of you are nerdy, like I'm prone to be, and you want to go and dig into the documents of what a libertarian paradise looks like, it looks like this. Bitcoin as the official tender of the island, voting being proportional to the amount of property each resident on the island owns, and complete rights for entrepreneurs to do medical experiments. Medical experiments, exactly the kind that our friend Elon Musk likes, which is for immortality. And I'm not making this stuff up. I kind of wish I was, because this is such dystopian kind of noir comedy stuff that I really couldn't write the script if I wanted to. When this is happening, of course, Roatan already belongs to somebody else. It belongs to the local fishing community, who then did protest and ask Peter Thiel and his friends to essentially get the fuck off the island. When they do that, they turn off the electricity supply and water supply to the entire fishing community there. But something still happens. The community protests and resists, and slowly, from the ashes of the very same party that was ousted with the help of the US military, a new party and a new movement emerges, and a new left government is once again elected in Honduras, with the first woman socialist president, Xiomara Castro, elected as the president of Honduras. And on her election campaign trail, the very first promise she makes is to abolish the Special Economic Zones law, what's called ZA in Honduras, should she be elected. So she is elected, and in a unanimous vote in the parliament, the ZA law is then abolished. Instantly, Honduras is hit with a corporate lawsuit, something to the tune of $10.7 billion. And if any of you are wondering what that amount is, for a small country like Honduras, that's 2/3 of its annual national budget. So that's how a US company is able to hold Honduras responsible for taking back essentially its own land. And this isn't, the problem with me telling you the story is that it isn't a unique story. It isn't an exceptionally horrific story. You go to Zimbabwe and you see the exact same story repeat itself. Back when Zimbabwe was Rhodesia and still under British colonial rule, we all know the story of how the white settler colonial families came in, farmers took over much of the arable land, leaving just 10% for the local black populations, what they call native reserves. Everything else was for the white settler families, and just the 10% was left for the local populations. So, of course, when there was a big independence movement for Zimbabwe, back then Rhodesia, land was the center of that movement. They do win independence and, of course, begin to take land back. And actually, it's one of the, if you look at land reform histories, it's one of the most ambitious land reform programs that's ever been attempted since the Cold War across the world. Well, what happens when they do that? Again, boom, instantly you have sanctions from the United Kingdom, from the United States, from the European Union, of course, with the full support of this country, the Netherlands, from which many of the farmers hailed from and came back to mobilize against the very same government. And then for the last 40 years now, for the last 20 years now, Zimbabwe has been under crippling sanctions. So once again, if you go to Harare, you see a people and you see a government that has the boot of the sanctions on its neck. And it doesn't stop there. Just as Honduras' stealth and theft didn't stop just at the ZA law and had to deal with a corporate lawsuit, in Zimbabwe too now, all of the former white farmers who had their lands taken away from them came back to the Netherlands, mobilized here, and with the full support of their government and with the full support of Washington, D.C., began to demand a compensation deal to the tune of $3.5 billion, which once again, for a small country crippled by sanctions like Zimbabwe, is not something that they have. And we know, again, if you go and look into the documents, see meeting minutes, that the implicit agreement is that if Zimbabwe pays the compensation deal to the former white farmers mobilizing from the Netherlands, then the United States will take off the sanctions. This is not money Zimbabwe has, so it goes to the African Development Bank to ask for a loan with incredibly tough conditions, pushing austerity once again on its own people, only to get that loan and pay back its former colonizers. So forget entering this new progressive era of reparations. Really, we're living in an era of reverse reparations, right? And again, this question of just people taking that land back and unable to do so despite decades and decades of plunder repeats and repeats and repeats itself. And nowhere, of course, is a more egregious example of people fighting for their land and life than in Palestine. The last time I was in the Netherlands was for The Hague at the International Court of Justice at the beginning of this year, when South Africa extremely courageously brought Israel and implicitly its backers to account at the ICJ at The Hague. And it was incredible to be inside that room. You know, when you enter the Peace Palace in The Hague, you have all these stained glass windows all around you, which is supposed to tell the kind of story of progress. But really, if you look at them, they're a big gift from the Carnegie Foundation. But really, if you look at the stained glass windows, they tell the story of evolution of progress, which actually is supposed to be European society spreading its ideals to those still stuck in primitive society, painted all across. So it was there was a bit of joy for South Africa and me as an Indian to be there in that room, bringing Israel to court, and the United States implicitly to court within that room, because we certainly couldn't see ourselves anywhere on those stained glass windows inside the ICJ. And much of that case, which was meticulously put together through evidence and facts collected on the ground at great risk by UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Services Agency, which of course came under attack immediately after the case. So 2 days into the ICJ hearing, we have the United States defund UNRWA. And a week after that, the New York Times publishes what we know now to be a widely debunked article about UNRWA being run entirely by militants, and Joe Biden signs into law the defunding of the United Nations agency all the way till March 2025. Why am I telling you all of these really horrific stories, especially when Jonas has given me the mandate of talking about solutions at the beginning of today's talk? It's because every single time that you see the people of the Global South try to take their own trade back, as in the case of Honduras, try to take their own land back, as in the case of Zimbabwe, or try to take our own institutions back, the very same institutions that were ostensibly set up for us, as in the case of South Africa at the ICJ, punishment comes swiftly and brutally every single time. And something has changed, right? Yesterday, someone said, oh, we all have the same enemies. But it's not just that we all have the same enemies. It's that our enemies have consolidated over time and space. And this, I think, is a fundamental point that I want to make. Not just that it's a continuum of colonialism that we've experienced of the past, but there's something even more vicious about the form in which we're seeing it today, where it's not just the Senegalese fighting against the French, or the Zimbabweans fighting against the British, or the Hondurans fighting against the Spanish. We're seeing all of us fight against this consolidated enemy in the form of our international trade treaties, in the form of our international financial institutions, and our international legal systems, which obfuscates the real enemy. It completely obfuscates who the enemy are and talks about these crises of ours in abstract terms. So biodiversity loss and food scarce countries indexes keep coming up every single time without telling us who it is that's causing the biodiversity loss, who it is that's actually creating the food insecurity. I mean, if you look at the genocide in Palestine, we know that just in the first 2 months of the conflict, we had more carbon emissions because of Israel's genocide in Gaza than what the 20 most climate vulnerable countries produce in a whole year. And we know that they were here at the ICJ for the last 2 weeks demanding that the global North countries pay respect to their obligations under climate treaties. I'm not saying this to say every question of genocide is a question of climate, or every question of war is a question of climate. Rather, the opposite, that every climate question is a question of war. It is a continuing war of the global North, of the imperial core against its periphery and against the peoples of the global South. So what can our response possibly be? Our response in the face of this consolidated enemy that seems to somehow hyper-powerfully, hyper-mobile, function across borders is to also then organize transnationally. That's the experiment that we're undertaking at the Progressive International. One of the examples that you've already heard is of the Make Amazon Pay campaign. What is the Make Amazon Pay campaign? The motto at Progressive International is make solidarity more than a slogan. I think for a few years now, certainly through when I was growing up, the idea of international solidarity got reduced to signing your name at the end of a petition. I stand in solidarity with this people suffering a war elsewhere. I stand in solidarity with this island that's drowning. But really, surely there's a material way in which solidarity has to become more than a slogan. And that's the experiment that we're looking at. So if Amazon is hypermobile and hyperpowerful and can move about everywhere, what does that do to our strength, to the strength of workers in Amazon factories? Excuse me. It means that the traditional model of the strike, so to speak, has to be rethought, right? So if you have Delhi workers in my city, for instance, go on strike, Amazon finds it incredibly easy to just shut down the whole warehouse and move somewhere else, whether that's to Bombay or to Hyderabad or to another country altogether. So to make the machine halt in the kind of traditional labor strike sense, we then need to strike all together, everywhere, all at once. That was an experiment that began 5 years ago at the founding of the Progressive International, with just 40 warehouses across the world, and none of them were unionized. So this was an industrial strike action, but it was a proof of concept. We just wanted to test the waters to see, could we possibly do something together in a coordinated fashion? And we did. And 5 years in now, we of course know that many of these workers have unionized, including in my own country, where it started as Amazon India Workers Association because it was illegal to form a union. And as of this Black Friday, it was a union. And they went on industrial strike action in over 210 locations across 42 countries around the world, actually bringing the machine to a halt on Black Friday, the biggest shopping day of Amazon. But there's something even more joyful when you do this kind of somewhat ambitious, somewhat audacious, maybe a bit crazy transnational organizing, which is campaigns develop a life of their own. So we had parliamentarians come on board and say, yeah, we want to stand alongside the workers that are going on strike. So from Ilhan Omar to Jeremy Corbyn, 400 of them pledged at the same time to regulate Amazon, not just for labor injustice, but for data injustice, for tech injustice, for climate injustice in each of their parliaments. No Tech for Apartheid, yet another campaign group, says, we're going to work with you along with Extinction Rebellion. We have to hold Amazon Web Services responsible for its complicity in the surveillance of Palestinians, in not just in the genocide in Gaza right now, but across every single place where Amazon security, across all the countries where Amazon security apparatus is being used, including against the Kurds, as we would have heard yesterday from Nilofer Kuch of the Kurdistan movement. But there are other experiments. What is Honduras supposed to do? So Honduras is now, the government has exited this clause called the Investor-State Dispute Settlement Clause, which is exactly what allowed a company like Peter Thiel's venture capitalist company to sue the Honduran government simply for protecting their own people. So it said, you know what, we're going to exit this clause altogether. And of course, it's in danger, right? Because it means that you have everybody making noise about it being a bad climate for investment, how this is now, lots of red scare, a terrible government to work with, try and push it the Cuba way where it gets isolated. No one country can do this alone. And we saw this in another war that was supposed to be a universal war, but wasn't, which was the war against COVID-19, where we were told we would all be together in this war and we'd all come up with a miracle, and any vaccine that was discovered would then belong to all of us. A year and a half into the discovery of the vaccines, and this is something I spent 2 years working on, we discovered that much of the developing world, much of the global south, had no options except to wait, arms outstretched, either for donations from governments in the global north, or wait for Big Pharma to, I guess, somehow find a conscience and release the recipes from under lock and key, which they were because of patent rules by our own World Trade Organization. So then we began to think, surely there has to be something else we as Global South governments could produce for ourselves and from ourselves. So we brought together another experiment, right? You don't think these things are going to work. We brought together the governments of Cuba, Mexico, Argentina, back then when there was still a good left government in Argentina, Kenya, Kisumu County, Kerala government in India, Venezuela, to all work together and say, can we produce vaccines together? And it was amazing. You don't often put health and foreign ministers in a room in one call and expect them to make commitments, but they did. Cuba said, we have 3 vaccine candidates, which they do because they've got an exceptional medical industry. Should any of them work, we'll commit this without patent for production of vaccines at solidarity prices. Argentina, Mexico said we don't have vaccine candidates, but we've got factories, and we can set aside 20% of them for a health internationalism block of production. Countries like Bolivia, which didn't have either of these things, no vaccine candidates, no production capacities, but they had money and they were desperate to buy vaccines for their people. And when they went to a Bill Gates or to Moderna, they were being told, actually, you have to stand at the back of the queue because Canada has bought up 2 years' worth of future doses of vaccines. So you still, even if you have money, you've got to wait. So they said, you know what, we'd rather finance a health internationalism bloc here as well. And they did. Of course, we had some obstacles because the WHO comes in and says, we don't really recognize Cuban vaccines, so you can't ship them here, you can't ship them there. So the Cubans do end up producing their vaccines and sending them to Nicaragua, to Iran, and to Vietnam, mainly to countries that are also sanctioned by the US as a bit of a fuck you. But it was great. We produced these vaccines at solidarity prices and showed materially that we could wrench market share away from them, and we would not submit to big pharma or to global north hegemony against at the cost of the life of the peoples of the global south. And the same is true for Palestine as well. When we go to these institutions and we try and subvert these institutions for our purposes and say, we're going to take them back, we get this ruling from the ICJ, we get this ruling from the ICC, arrest warrants are finally here, 2 years late, but they're here now, but still nothing happens. What do you see? You see the very same, the consolidated enemy bloc once again breaking from that order. Hungary immediately declares it's going to defy ICC arrest warrants. It will not arrest Netanyahu if he sets foot on Hungarian soil. France says, actually, we think Netanyahu has immunities because Israel hasn't signed up to the Rome Statute. Not something they remembered in the case of Putin when there was an arrest warrant that was issued against them, and Russia is also not party to the Rome Statute. And the same, of course, is true for Meloni in Italy, who simply declared it's unfeasible to arrest Netanyahu, whatever the hell that means, right? Now, what do you do in this case? You have to take every single institution back into our hands. And in this case, if they're not going to stop the ships going to Israel, laden with arms, laden with jet fuel, perhaps we could. Once again, an experiment. We got wind of this one ship called Overseas Santorini that had jet fuel that was heading from Corpus Christi Chris Christie is the governor of New Jersey, Corpus Christi in the port in Texas in the United States to Ashkelon in Israel. And we saw from every ship, by the way, has to declare its locations, and you can track it on the website. So we had a fun little game over a weekend. Some of us were drinking, tracking the ship, where is it going? And we saw that it was headed towards Algeciras, the port in Spain. Immediately, dock workers in Spain began to mobilize. Our parliamentarian members in Spain began to mobilize and say, these are ships of death, and we will not let them dock in Spain in order to take what we call weapons of destruction to Gaza. And so the ship had to change course. It abandoned that, and you saw a new location pop up on the website. And it was now headed towards Gibraltar, which meant, once again, we had to immediately, quickly mobilize. So our parliamentarian colleagues in the UK wrote to David Lammy, who then wrote to the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, Fabian Picardo, and said these ships cannot dock in Gibraltar. Once again, the ship had to change its route and started heading towards Cyprus, where, of course, because it's a Progressive International with its network of progressive parties, there was AKIL, which is a Progressive Working People's Party, which once again mobilized both its unions at the dock as well as its own government to say this ship, the Overseas Santorini, could not dock in Cyprus. So then it goes dark, which, by the way, is illegal under military law, but the dot disappears from the website because it's trying to figure out where the hell to stop and refuel before it goes to Israel, and comes alive 48 hours later, having suddenly reached Ashkelon in Israel. We still don't know what path it took, which is a blatant violation of international law and maritime law, but it still does that. What does that do? It now means that it gave us that infrastructure to set up a full-blown team with the Progressive International in collaboration with our comrades at the Palestinian Youth Movement and some data researchers who still want to remain anonymous, to set up a full-blown operation to look across the different sources of information, from the guy at Port Authority who's picking up the phone and saying, I see on this bills of lading that I've just received that there's a ship, it says it's delivering arms to IFS. IFS actually is just a fake company registered in Delaware. I know it's actually arms that are going to Israel. So then you go look it up in Delaware's records, someone pulls those up, turns out it's Maersk, the shipping container company that does much of the shipping for Israel, and you have dock workers across the board who are finding out the route and mobilizing at every single point. And this is now happening across different routes in the Mediterranean, from Turkey to Italy to Spain, under a huge campaign called No Harbor for Genocide. These are not foolproof solutions. I'm not telling you that I have all of the answers of what we need to stop the climate ecocide, but in the face of this transnational, ever-intensifying, ever-consolidating assault, we need to think not just at the same scale, which is everywhere, all together, all at once, but also really creatively and kind of audaciously. So in the case of Israel's shipping companies, for instance, it does look like looking at a few specific ports in order to stop the ship. Sometimes it looks like looking at just a few companies. Of course, you can't track down every single ship that's headed to Israel, but we know that every ship needs insurance, and all of Israel's ships are insured by 4 companies that are registered all in the United Kingdom. So you don't need 100 unions, you just need one of them, one group within one of those companies in the United Kingdom to unionize and say, actually, we're not going to work in this insurance company. We're going on strike unless you stop insuring Israeli ships, which has happened, by the way, in other parts of the world where insurance companies have stopped insuring Israeli ships. So this is, I suppose, my approach, my solution, as Jonas has given me the mandate here today, which is to really, truly think in serious internationalist, anti-imperialist terms. And yesterday, I heard somebody say, we can't just be fact-checking, we have to be propagating. If I could put it another way, we have to, on the left and across progressive forces everywhere, which remain as a self-criticism, kind of stuck in our inherited rivalries and still remain discoordinated, we have to stop playing defense and mount our own united transnational attack against our enemies. Thank you very much for giving me your time.
Okay, catch your breath. We ask you to talk about how to transform the planet. You transform the room to begin with. And you even managed to smuggle Chris Christie into your story. I don't know how you did that. I have one basic question for now. Later on we'll continue. Listening to the stories and the examples you're giving us, what is your mindset at the beginning when you realize it's time to mobilize a true international network of solidarity? Is it to reclaim existing institutions and laws to do what they're actually for, like the ICJ in the case of South Africa against Israel? Or is it to invent new structures because our common enemy is not playing according to the rules either? What is the basic mindset that you enter a problem with?
The basic mindset that we enter the problem with is that we know what's currently exists is not working, and that needs to go. That needs to break, that needs to die. Now, what comes after, whether it's a reformed institution or an altogether new institution, depends entirely on the coalition that we're putting together. The non-aligned movement and the new international economic order, which was brought together by the newly liberated countries in the 60s, for instance, did talk about their own version of new institutions that looked very different from the Bretton Woods. Perhaps it's a return to those institutions and not a reform of these. But for me, as a coordinator, and I very much think of myself as playing a switchboard role of connecting progressive forces, connecting progressive states across the world, I wouldn't quite approach it as a premature, here I've got the solution, let me see who are the candidates I can sell this to, but rather that there is a common united understanding that we need to build something different. Let's start thinking about what that is and doing it.
Okay, thanks. We'll hear more from you later. Vasya Gandikota.